So, hi everyone, I'm Victor, I'm a security engineer at Ledger. I'm going to talk today about implementing threshold signatures on a secure element. No worries if you don't know what a threshold signature is, I'm going to recap that. Same for a secure element. If you do know what a threshold signature is and then are worried that there might be too much math in my presentation, there isn't, no worries. So, I'm going to say what the initial problem was. This is a performance and implementation constraint 1. Recap what is a threshold signature and specifically what is threshold ECDSA, because that's the algorithm we're going to use. The overview and the existing solution for threshold signatures. Then I'm going to show you what are the characteristics over our secure elements, the constraints, get some estimates of the running time of a threshold signature, and then talk about the proof of concept that we implemented. So there's a lot of coins displayed here because at Ledger we try to be coin agnostic, so we had to target ECDSA and not another signature algorithm because that's the one that covers the most coins. So the initial problem is this, that we were not certain that existing solutions for threshold signing are adapted to small embedded devices like the secure element we use in Ledger Nano S, for example. It could be way too slow. It's quite slow, actually. Maybe it would never fit in memory because some schemes actually send a lot of data, send and receive a lot of data. So the goal was to get some estimates, try to see if it would fit, if any of the schemes would fit, and implement a proof of concept if we find something that works. So, about threshold ECDSA. So, threshold signing is a subdomain of multi-party computation. They allow placing the control of an account, or rather signing transactions, among several people, right? So, you want to spread your secret key among several devices, several people. So that you're not, well, if someone breaks into your device, you don't lose all your funds. At once you need to break into several devices to do that. The advantage of doing that rather than multi-signature on chain, for example, is that you're still viewed as a single entity, right? So you're a group of people signing as one person. This reduces the fees that you would have on transaction because you're just sending one signature and one public key. So it's just like a normal transaction, although you're several people signing behind it. And as I said, yeah, ECDSA is the most common one for signing transaction among coins. So that's the one we're targeting here. No Schnorr, no BLS. Just to illustrate how this works, so you have to imagine that you have 5 devices that, for example, for a 3 out of 5 scheme, 5 devices that register together as a single entity. They want to produce a signature, and they want to allow any subset of 3 devices among them to be able to sign and produce a valid signature, right? So if you have 2 gray devices, those are the ones that are not used, and the 3 black ones are the ones that will cooperate and try to sign something. The other property you'd like is, of course, if you have only 2 signers in your 3 out of 5 scheme, it will produce garbage, right? You won't be able to produce a valid signature with that. And the next property is if you have someone cheating during the protocol, so you have to imagine that the devices are exchanging values and data to compute something. If one player is corrupt and is actively deviating from the protocol, trying to cheat, sending the wrong values, trying to leak information from the others, for example, you want to be able to at least abort everything in the process, or even detect that and identify the cheater, for example. There are several variations in the protocols. Just to give you an idea of the main problem we have here is, this is how you generate the ECDSA signature scheme, and this is the only math I'm going to display here. Here we have 2 secret values, for example, the simple K at the first line, which has to be a random value, and SK on the 4th line is your secret key. Now you have to imagine that you want to produce this here, but you distributed K and SK among several people. So just to summarize the problem, right? I'm not going to be correct mathematically here, but what you want to do, for example, is at some point you want to multiply the inverse of K, which will be shared, with SK, which will be shared as well. So you want to compute this, but not like this. You want to absolutely avoid reconstructing the actual secret in the process. You want to go from having SK shared among 3 people here, for example, be able to compute the signature, so the end result here, without ever leaking anything about the actual secret value. So this is a tricky problem, right? But I'm not going to delve into the details of this of the solutions here. I'm just interested in measuring the performance, right? And if you can actually implement this. So we can sum up, I mean, just to measure performance, we can sum up the problem as how basically do you multiply two shared variables. So you have to imagine the protocol as something that communicates as well, right? So the two devices, for example, here, will have to exchange a lot of messages in order to compute that multiplication. So there's going to be a communication problem and a computation problem on your device. As of 2020, there was a nice survey that was published. There were 8 existing solutions. And so as I said, we can try to split them according to the way they multiply shared variables in order to get the performance. I put 3 categories in here. So you have the ones based on PIE encryption, which is an additively homomorphic encryption scheme. Again, we don't need to go into the details here. It's very heavy in computation time, very low in communication. So you need to spend a lot of time on the CPU, but you don't need to set a lot of values to other devices. The other one is based on oblivious transfers, very low computation time, but heavy in communication. And the third one is based on just Shamir sharing. So it's actually the starting point of a threshold signature. When you split the secret among several people, you do a Shamir secret sharing, and you can actually multiply 2 variables that are Shamir shared. But there's a trick, there's a practical limitation to that. So it's very long computation, very long communication, but there is one practical limitation, which is in the way you tolerate corrupt people. So the red device that I showed earlier. Usually, what PIE and oblivious transfer schemes allow you to do is to detect a dishonest majority, right? So if you're 5 people signing and you have 4 cheaters with you, the protocol still will detect that there are 4 cheaters and will not issue a signature that is valid. The problem with Shamir sharing that you need to be in a honest majority setting, meaning that the protocol will not detect then you have more than 50% of people cheating. And it will produce a signature that could be completely invalid and leak information. So although it's quite fast, right, you have this practical limitation. The problem we had, of course, is that although you have this description of 8 existing solutions, they were all implemented on desktop CPUs or mobile phones, and this doesn't translate well on an embedded device, so we have no idea how fast it would go, right? So I'm going to switch now to our target. This is the Ledger Nano S, open, of course. You can see the secure element is in the yellow box. That's an ST31H320. The CPU runs at 28 megahertz, which, if you need a point of reference, that's twice as fast as a Game Boy Advance CPU. It's not a good reference, but it's got 10 kilobytes of RAM, which is not much. The flash is a bit irrelevant here. The thing that makes it special to evaluate performance here is that it has a cryptographic coprocessor, right? So you don't just use, for example, an existing library that does a Threshold ECDSA and put it on and run it on the CPU. It would be way too slow. You have a cryptographic coprocessor that handles the heavy lifting, like multiplication modulo something for very large numbers, and it goes very, very fast. Actually, it's very fast at that. Also for the communication part, this is going to be an interesting point, is that this was designed for smart card usage, like banking cards. These do not need to communicate a lot, so the standard that's usually used is this one, ISO 7816, and the max bandwidth you can reach with that is quite low. So if you need to send a lot of things over the network, for example, this is going to be the bottleneck, not the latency, right? And obviously it's single-threaded. Yeah, let's not dream. So we're quite far even from a low-end mobile phone there. So even we can see that even some assumptions that are made in the papers, the published papers, are already wrong here. Like one that is seen often is that the computation time is dwarfed by network latency, right? So you spread your keys over the globe. You have 3 participants, one in India, one in the US, one in France. So if you have 100 milliseconds of ping and you need to send several messages to those people, well, the time you spend computing a scalar multiplication, for example, doesn't matter. It's much less than 10 milliseconds, for example, for a mobile phone. So you won't see that. Hashing is usually considered negligible. And, well, transmitting 100 kilobytes of data is instant. You're already on the network. It's the blink of an eye. But on our device, one scalar multiplication, optimistically, is 100 milliseconds. And I think you can only reach that time if you discard all side channel countermeasures and fault injection countermeasures that we usually want to keep. Hashing is about 2 milliseconds, so it's not negligible anymore. And sending 1 kilobyte of data, well, you already need to get that out of the secure element before you send it to the networks, and that takes about 1.2 seconds to get 100 kilobytes of data out of this. So now let's try to get some estimates. So the first one is for PIE encryption-based multiplication. The main operation we'll be doing is PIE encryption, and this is the most horrible thing you can ask to a secure element. It's a modular exponentiation with 4,000 bits on operands. Optimistically, again, I want a lower bound on the execution time, so everything here is optimistic. That would take 1 second. The other operation that you need for, I think this is for the range proofs in the middle, is modular exponentiation with half the size of the operands, and at 400 milliseconds. So as I said, there are some range proofs that are for most of the protocols, the real bottleneck here in computation time, but there's one protocol that makes light use of it, so and provides numbers. So we're going to use that one as an estimate. Key generation, which is not really interesting here because this is the one-time thing, would take a few minutes, which is actually quite slow, but it doesn't matter. For oblivious transfer based, we focus on communication time because that's the one that's heavy on that. And the latest protocol, which is actually the fastest available, requires sending about 90 kilobytes of data per player per multiplication. In ECDSA, we need to perform 2 multiplications. So as I said, this is about 1.2 seconds, and in the slides before. And that's assuming that we can send everything at once, which we can't because we have 10 kilobytes of RAM. Again, also, how do you handle receiving 80 kilobytes of RAM? It's not all at once, right? So 1.2 seconds is, again, a lower bound estimate. And for the setup time, so this just a few elliptic curve scalar multiplications, so it's not, let's say it's not much. So just to summarize, here are some ugly formulas and nice references. We're focusing mostly on the last column. So in the signature cost, or the live cost, basically, is 21 times the number of players by encryption. And for oblivious transfers is more complicated, but you see there's a lot of hashing as well as a lot of communication. Just to put that with concrete numbers, luckily they're about the same. So estimated time for a 2 out of 3 scheme, we see that it's at least, again, this is very optimistic, at least 21 seconds just to sign something with 2 players out of 3. So now I'm going to talk about the last option that we have, because this sounds a little too slow for our needs. I'm going to talk about the method that uses Shamir sharing, and that's the one we implemented. So this is a joint work with CPR, which is based in Denmark. This is the protocol that they published. So the advantage is it's very simple, very lightweight operations. Shamir multiplication is just, well, there's mostly multiplication module or something. Plus some proofs where you will need scalar multiplication, but that's one huge advantage in my opinion, because if you have something cryptography that is simple to implement, it's even better because you won't make as many mistakes as you would do for the other protocols. But the drawback is, as I said, it's honest majority setting, so you cannot do a 2 out of 2 scheme, for example. That's impossible. You won't be able to detect cheating. And also it requires all participants to compute most of the signature. So even in a 2 out of 3 scheme, you would spend most of the time computing things with 3 people instead of 2, which feels weird at the beginning, but we can work around that actually. So the proof of concept we implemented was in Rust, which is, well, this is another interesting aspect. You can use Rust on a very constrained embedded environment, and it's really much better than C. Much easier to use also, and This was an interesting experiment also because you need to handle a cryptographic coprocessor, which has its own dedicated RAM, so you need to handle dynamic allocation, all in an embedded environment, and the result is much better than C. So just a side note here. So what was implemented is the ST31 would be one player in Rust, and it would be discussing with just a Python script that simulates the two other players. And the whole thing takes less than 3 seconds. And that's a hard upper bound, in contrary to the other schemes where it was at least, in a very optimistic way, 21 seconds. We won't be spending more than 3 seconds for sure assigning. So this was including some key generation, like out of the blue, which is not BIP32, which is different treatment. But again, this is a one-time setup, so it's not that important here. And also, due to the protocol, we need to spend most of the time with 3 players, so 3 nano devices, although one of them is not really important to generate the signature. But again, you can work around the protocol so that most of the stuff with 3 players happens at the setup, and you can convert those shares to work in a 2 out of 3 fashion, so that when you receive your transaction, you're actually doing an actual 2 out of 3 signing, and not a 3 out of 3. But anyway, even if it was 3 out of 3, that's already a nice multi-signature scheme. So the conclusion is this. So Threshold ECDSA looks definitely feasible on a device like a Ledger Nano S. This is something that was worrying just reading the papers. Everything looked either too big or too slow. And so this is a nice argument we can make, because usually people say that either you have a hardware wallet and you're safe on a physical side, or you can use MPC and spread your secrets between a mobile phone and a server and something else. Well, now it seems we can do both. So, right, an even more secure scheme, I hope. So this is not a product I'm talking about, right? This is not available on your Ledger Nano. This is just research and development here. But I hope we can put that in practice. So of course, if it's feasible on Nano S, it's also feasible on Nano X, which is a beefier version. Probably you won't be able to do anyway like a 20 out of 50 scheme, but I'm not sure who needs that. Also, just an interesting note, people are trying to work around the limitations of current threshold and multi-signature schemes by just changing the way they sign. So Bitcoin is moving to Schnorr signatures, so multi and threshold signatures are actually much more simple with Schnorr, and Ethereum is moving to BLS, which is even better in that regard. So that would be interesting. And just a few info about the practical aspect of things. To get that into a product, we would need to handle the more engineering details like nano-to-nano communication and external storage for pre-signatures, like if you want to move some things in the setup phase rather than in the online phase. Needs anti-replay and a bunch of other practical stuff, but the result is here. It's not taking too much time to actually do a threshold signature, Threshold ECDSA specifically on Nano S. And that's it. Any questions? Oh, no questions? Or very quickly? Yeah. Okay.
Could you please explain in a little bit more detail how to use Shamir sharing for the signatures? So you're not splitting the secret key, right? So you're not splitting the private key, or do you?
Yes. Yeah. So you start with a splitting from the private key as Shamir shares. Mm-hmm. And the simple thing when you need to perform the operations here, so the multiplication, you just multiply the shares. But the problem is if you start from a sharing of 3 in 3 keys, multiplying them will give you a result that is a sharing with 6 players. It's you double the degree of the sharing. So well, there's a -1 somewhere so that it works in a 2 out of 3 setting, for example. But basically, this is why you need to have all players communicating, because even in a 2 out of 3 setting, you're going to be splitting your 2 shares into something that is of degree 4, 3. So you need all 3 players to recombine. But it's just a multiplication. You just effectively multiply the
Got
shares.
you. Thanks you.
My question is about, do you considering like async communication during initial setup? Because, for example, imagine like people on different like continents, and maybe like it's worth to consider like this setup. Is it change things a lot or not?
You mean asynchronous?
Yeah, asynchronous initial setup.
Yeah, you can do a little bit of things that way, but it's not something I've looked at a lot, because this is to me this is another problem of regrouping the communication that you can send in one go. And I hope this is your question. But so all the numbers I've done here are discarding that aspect. It's all just computation time and communication from the device to something that is right there. It's not accounting for latency on the network. So, because to me this is a different problem of where and when do you send your messages. But this hopefully is already documented in the published papers, and this is not something that we would need to handle on our own for the device, right? This is a problem independent of the device, I think.
Thank you.
Oh, no worries. That's okay.
So we'll have a chat. Thank you.